This is That 80s Show, and today we're speaking to Jason Curtis. Now, Jason was the editor of Top 40 magazine, which was a music magazine in South Africa, and was also very much involved in the music industry for a number of years. Jason, how are you today? Where do we find you in the world? What's happening in your life?
Good afternoon, and thanks, Barrett. It's good to chat to you, and congratulations on an extraordinary show. I think you're doing some great work.
Thank you.
I find myself in Cape Town. I've been in Cape Town for the last 22 odd years. I actually came down to Cape Town expressly to take over the editorship of Top 40 magazine back in 1999, so relatively late in the day, but I had been contributing to the magazine for a good decade before that. So my journey began in music from a journalistic perspective back in 1991. This is the 80s show, but everything that was early 90s was influenced and was certainly very active during the 90s. So as you've experienced with the interviews that you continue to do. So that's kind of where I find myself. And I've been involved in the music industry pretty much since that time. I've had a passion for music since the age of 11 or 12. And my first single that I ever bought was Talk, 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 Talk.
Okay.
So their debut single on 7-inch from the CNA, which was the place to go to get your music back in those days. And that relationship with music hasn't left me. It started, I think, in a garage in Edenvale back in the 70s, when I used to sit with my father's reel-to-reel recorder and try and replicate KW, what was it called? KW, whatever it was. It was a show on SABC. It was an American show.
Oh, WKRP in Cincinnati.
Thank you. Yeah. And basically I would sit in front of the microphone and basically mimic the fact that I was a DJ on radio, and that was before the age of 10. So music has stayed with me since that age. I'm currently 52, so you can do the math on that, and I remain heavily invested in the overall entertainment economy to this day.
It's interesting because Dory and Paolo, their favorite shows, kids, were WKRP in Cincinnati as well, and they in the radio industry. So it motivated them to get into that space. And tell me, how many years was the Top 40 magazine in existence for?
It was around for 19 years, of which I edited the final 3 years of its living kind of printed reality. And then we worked really hard to move it into a digital space. So that happened probably at around about 2001, 2002, because obviously everything was kind of pivoting towards digital. So we had to move very quickly into that digital space, and we did it, I think, very effectively at the time. But the overall music industry had fundamentally changed from the way that it was selling music, how it was marketing music. So it was a very interesting time to play in that space and just understand this new technology that was kind of still relatively new. I mean, if you think about it, late 90s, the internet had only been around, for 4 or 5 years at that stage. So it was still a relatively new concept, and nobody truly understood the power of it and what it could actually do. Obviously, we understand that now because we live it. So Top 40 was kind of a legacy beast that responded to a particular audience at a particular time, a bit like SABC TV, when you were reliant on what was delivered to you or that you could pick up in the CNA. You didn't have the benefit of the internet to check information or to listen to something streaming. You would wait, diligently wait for the next issue of Top 40 to arrive. So basically it was a time when kids would put posters on walls of their favorite bands and artists, and we looked to try and appeal to as broad an audience, because if you think about it, South Africa is always, its music tastes have been informed by kind of Europe and America. So it was a weird mix of both of those influences. And then you obviously had the local component as well. But we did suffer from that terrible term that was massively overtraded called local is lekker, which did no favors to the South African music industry, because everybody kind of assumed that South African music was kind of second or played second fiddle to what was happening in the rest of the world. And that really wasn't true. I think our production standards were not to par, but the music that was being generated and created out of South Africa was extraordinary. But, you know, radio also didn't support local music in the way that it should have. And I think Top 40 definitely tried to, you know, promote the Sugar Drives, the Amishams, the bands certainly of the time that I was involved with Top 40. But Top 40's legacy is, you know, the way that people feel about it. It's a very emotional thing because it was, you know, there was nothing else to distract you away from what was happening. Like I said, you didn't have Netflix, you didn't have DSTV, you didn't have the world streaming around you. You had to wait for this content to arrive, and it was printed. And then you paid your 15 rand for it. And then you went home and you consumed it, and you put the posters on the walls, and you sang back the lyrics that were published in the magazine. So, yeah, a very sentimental time, I think.
So it's similar. I remember as a kid collecting the UK smash hits and number one magazine. So I loved all of that. You know, it was waiting for that anticipation of receiving it and seeing who was being interviewed and seeing who was being featured. And I very much followed the charts at the time, and I always used to look at those magazines and think that artist should be getting more exposure. They're not getting enough exposure.
Exactly. And the thing is, the Top 40, you know, as it evolved, I mean, it was started back in the day by Joe Turon, and it was JT Publishers that started it. And then when CDs arrived, you know, in the late 80s, I think one of the first commercial released CDs was Dire Straits Brothers in Arms. Then they kind of realized that, hold on, there's a market there that they need to tap into. But Top 40 kind of modeled itself on being kind of a number one, or a combination of number one and kind of smash hits, because it was a pop magazine. It was about what pop culture was, you know, what was being played on the radio, what was Radio 5 back in the day playing. And we were traditionally, we were about 90 days behind the rest of the world. So when you were reading smash hits, it was an issue that was 3 months old when it landed from the ship, right? So, you know, we suffered this weird lag, but by the time we got the magazine, the music had actually arrived in the country, which was great. But there was this weird kind of delay. So you felt weirdly current because of what you were reading in smash hits, but it was actually already 3 months old, if you follow my logic.
Yeah, absolutely. When you were a journalist before becoming editor for the magazine, what did that mean? What was it, a full-time job, part-time job? And what were you actually doing for the magazine becoming the editor?
Well, interestingly, I got into it professionally because a very good friend of mine, a school friend of mine, landed up getting a job as the art director at Top 40 magazine in 1991. Again, early 90s. And he, I think a few weeks into his job, he was handed a kind of a pile of CDs and said, don't you just want to write some reviews for the magazine? And he was new, so he didn't want to disappoint anyone. So he said, yes, no, of course I'll do it. And then he got in his car, drove to my flat in Sunnyside, Pretoria, and said, dude, you've got to help me. And at that point, I was studying journalism. Well, I was studying English at UNISA. And somehow he thought that I would be able to do this. So I said, lovely, I'll happily do it because I'm getting 3 new CDs that I didn't have to pay for.
Yeah.
And so his reviews, they were published under his name. And I think clearly the editor at the time was happy and went back to this friend of mine, Ken, and said, great, will you do some more? And then he kind of fessed up and said, no, it wasn't me, it was my friend Jason. They said, we don't care how this happened, just introduce us to Jason. So I then got introduced to them. They then started sending me what I needed to review. And I think I was paid, it was, I can't even recall what I got paid, but I think at one point I was writing pretty much 90% of the magazine as a freelancer and being paid the equivalent of about 1,200 Rand. But it was pure passion because music was my passion. And the reason why I did it was because it gave me access to the music that I loved. So there was a lot of stuff in there that I didn't like, but I was always open to everything, whether it was blues, whether it was rock, whatever it was. Dance music, I never truly understood, but I immersed myself in it because I wanted to be able to do right by it and try and understand why everybody else was thinking that this was the next big thing. So long story short, it was very selfish. It was, music was expensive to buy.
Yeah.
And so now all of a sudden I had access to this music and it was being given to me. And I was happy to write the reviews literally in a barter system where it's a case of you give me the music, I'll write the review. I get to keep the music, and I'm golden. But what I did do in the very early days was that I realized the second that I had something published, I could then go to the record companies and say to them, hi, I'm the guy from Top 40 who wrote the review about your artist, whether it was The Farm or, something that the Clash was doing or whatever it was, and say, I'd like to interview these people. And so that was what I did. It gave me an in so that the record companies would take my calls. And so then I said, there's this artist called Tori Amos, and I really want to interview her because, yes, I love her album. I've reviewed her album, but I want to talk to her. So whether it was Erasure, whether it was Luther Vandross, whether it was, say, Depeche Mode, that was how I got access, because I had a platform that I could show to the record companies that I was doing work for them already. And then I became their friends, and I would go through to each of the record labels every week diligently, get in my car during my lunch break from my normal day job to pick up all the new music, and then go away. And when everyone else was watching the rugby on the weekend, I was writing an interview.
These interviews you're speaking of, were they for Top 40 magazine, or you were still doing them for yourselves?
I was doing them independently. So what I did was I widened my network very quickly, because obviously I had Top 40 as a base because I was a freelancer writing for them. But then not every interview opportunity that came up was necessarily a good fit for Top 40. So then I went to the likes of The Star, and I went to the independent group and said, hey, I've just done an interview with whichever artist, Lenny Kravitz or whoever it may have been at the time. And I said, hey, would you like this interview as an exclusive? And they would say, yes, great. And then they would take that interview and syndicate it. But I would always offer it to Top 40 first. And if they declined it, then I would obviously look further, to the point that I pretty much wrote for every major magazine and newspaper over probably a 20-odd year period of time. And kind of, I think my biggest coup was getting an interview that I did with David Sylvian from Japan, a very prolific 80s band. And I thought, literally in South Africa, there would be 50 people who actually knew who David Sylvian was and who Japan were as a band. Mm-hmm. And I managed to get it onto the cover of the Sunday Times magazine, which in its day, if you got into the newspaper first and foremost, that was a coup. But if you could get onto the cover of the magazine, which was kind of the sweet spot of your Sunday reading, and I managed to get this interview and a cover with David Sylvian, and which I laugh about to this day. But it's remarkable how I would push these interviews, because for me, ultimately, as a journalist, what I wanted to do was to marry the story behind the music that we were all listening to and loving, and with the backstory, then having the music that you loved being kind of amplified by understanding, what the Cranberries were writing about and the motivation behind the lyric, or whether it was Texas or whether it was whoever it was at the time. My point was to kind of be the bridge between the music and the artist. And that's kind of what I did.
So you were basically Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for the day.
Very well said. Yes, I totally was. And I was a complete prostitute, in the sense that what I wanted to do was to, whoever would publish something, I would give it to them. And in some cases, I gave a lot of my work away pro bono, because I just wanted the story to land so that it would satisfy the record company, so that the record company would keep me in good favor, or that I would be in good favor with them, because I wanted to keep that channel open, because I remain hungry to this day to hear and be a part of this, music that's being created. But as much as, people who I was working with a pool. There was probably about 5 to 8 freelance and active journalists who were writing in the entertainment space when there were newsrooms, that had people in them, and they had sub-editors and entire teams putting, content together. And a lot of these guys would go, oh no, I'm not going to speak to Sheryl Crow at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd get the call saying, Jason, there's an interview opportunity with Sheryl Crow. Do you want to do it? But it's 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And I would go, yes. I never, ever turned an interview down, not once. Whether it was 3:00 in the morning or, at some ungodly hour, I took it because, it was that rare moment where you got 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes if you were lucky with an artist. And it was a joy just to spend time with them and get to know them. And in many cases, I built firm friendships with a lot of the artists where, 4 or 5 interviews in, we would land up spending half the time speaking about the dog and poll tax and everything else before we actually got into talking about the music, which was lovely.
I totally agree, because now doing the interviews for that 80s show, I'm creating friendships and relationships with some of these artists. And one of my favorite singers from the 80s phoned me the other day, and now we're having WhatsApp messages over the phone. And a couple of weeks ago, I was busy at work having like a 10-minute conversation with her. And I sat back in my chair and I'm like, what just happened right now? This is so bizarre. But then we realize that, yes, they are artists. That's the field they've chosen to work in or participate in. And I've said this to all my friends and so many people, we all use the same toilet paper. It's either 1-ply or 2-ply. No one's got gold-plated or platinum toilet paper. So whenever I go into an interview, I like, okay, cool. You using the same, not exactly the same, but the same toilet paper as I, and we are on the same level. Everyone is on the same level.
Ultimately, they're human beings, right? And some of the closest interactions that I've had with various artists on a very human level, whether it was Depeche Mode or Luther Vandross or Janet Jackson. At the end of the day, these are people. They are human beings, and they suffer all the fallibilities and foibles that we all do. But they present, right? They are performers. So we see them way up there. But at the end of the day, I remember sitting with the late, great Luther Vandross at the Westcliff in Joburg at a time in his career when he had just fired his manager of like 25 years as he got off the plane in Johannesburg, and being obviously distraught. But none of the 100 people that he had brought in with him were interested in suffering his real life truth. And I sat with him literally on waiting for a ride down to the reception. And he kind of just unbundled and shared with me. And I respected that space. And I think that's why the people that you're talking to now, if you treat them with respect, as I've always done with every interview that I've ever done, is that you take the time to pay attention, but as in deep listen to what they're saying, and you allow the interviews to go where they want them to go, because you will always get what you need from the interview if you take it where they want to. Because if you think about it, certainly when an artist like Coldplay or whoever it is releasing a new album, they're doing kind of 20 to 30 interviews a day.
Yeah.
So by the time you get to them as poor old South Africa, interview number 28, they are tired. They have been asked the same question 100 times, and they just want to go to bed, or they just want to go and be normal people. And so many of the interviews that I've done where I think I remember interviewing Snow Patrol, where I did an entire interview and they said to me, okay, well, let's start the interview. And I said, well, we've just done it. And they went, what do you need? And I said, no, everything that I needed, I got by just having a very open, frank, and respectful conversation. And they were completely blown away. They didn't know what to. And it's about, getting to someone like, who was it? It was, I'm trying to remember his name. It was like a one-hit wonder, but literally getting to him after he had just had a particularly bad interview with a journalist who hadn't done his research, hadn't done his homework, and then I get him. So now he's agitated, and I've got 15 minutes, and I've got to try and get my story out of this man, and to talk him off the ledge, bring him down, and that takes about 4 to 5 minutes. Then I've only got 10 minutes left to get what I need, and then that's the sweet spot. And immediately, the second that they can hear that you're paying attention, and you're not just firing questions at them, you get real gold, you get gems, you get some of their soul, which is kind of what you're going for. Yeah, we all know where the album was recorded. We all know who the producer was. We all know, it was done in 10 days, but give me the motivation. How did this song that means so much to me? I mean, Alanis Morissette, classic example. Jagged Little Pill was a deep album, and there was a lot to unpack. But most of the journalists just kind of flew over the top of it. Whereas, these artists are intelligent people, and they very quickly pick up on the journalists who are invested, have done the research, and are being respectful of their time.
It's interesting because I used to do much more research pre the Leo Sayer interview, and I used to write out all the questions. And I found that by doing that, it lacked the flow of just having a conversation. So now what I do, unless they ask the questions, I say, I just start talking, and it's about being engaged with what they're saying and diving deeper. And
let them take it. Let them take it where they want it to go. And you'll get your answers. Yeah, because you'll have your 10 questions that you very delftfully, as they talk, you talk to those various points, but in their language. So you kind of learn to speak Xhosa. You learn to speak whichever artist it is that you're interviewing, because you're deep listening to how they are responding. And I think it's a skill. It's a bit of an art to be able to do that.
Well, if you think of it, every person should be doing it, because whether they're interviewing someone as a journalist or not, when they're talking to each other, they should be listening and should be engaged in what their respondent is saying to them.
If they're invested, which sadly, you are the exception. The majority of them they're doing their job. So they're just kind of going through the motions. And there's nothing more soul destroying with something like music, which is an entirely creative reality, where someone's just firing questions at you and not listening to what you are actually saying and picking up on kind of the nuance of that conversation.
And also, don't you agree that a lot of journalists are trained to pick up, in inverted commas, the dirt, and how to create that dirt into a mud pile of sensationalism in order to create a furor? Because human nature is, we want the tasty, sensationalist, negative elements. So if it's positive and affirming and good, well, they sort of brush that over because it's like, oh, this isn't juicy enough for me.
No, it's tragic because we've become so tabloid in our thinking. But there is an audience out there that are true fans of these artists, and they don't want the sensationalism. What they want to know is they want to get a little bit closer to this artist that has informed and formed so much of either their youth or their adulthood, and they want to get a lot closer. I mean, more recently, I did an interview with Josh Groban, and he's he's an artist from the 90s, but still that was where his career started. What would have been even early 90s. The point being that what people were looking for was a connection with this artist that they loved. So it is sad when you have a tabloid mentality, which is tragic, because the reason why these journalists are trained this way is that it's all obviously clickbait. So it's a case of numbers and getting shareability and likes and everything else. The weird thing is that my approach has always been an organic one, so that if the message is good and if it's well presented, you can achieve what you need to in an authentic way and respect the artist's integrity in an entirely organic way, which I kind of like, because if it does for whatever reason trend, then it trends in a respectful way, and you're not trading on the fact that you saw somebody's top drop or you saw them bitch slap somebody or whatever the case is, and what? That's not news. That's just like, what I want to know is, what was Suzi Quatro thinking about when she wrote, her biggest hit? That's the stuff that if you can land it in a way that I can give you new information that nobody knew before or that few people knew before, that's the stuff that's gold. That's the stuff that's shareable. That's the stuff that gives you credibility as certainly in your case as Cliff Central is going, I heard it first there because they took the time to do the heavy lifting and understand that at the time that she wrote that song, she wasn't in a particularly good place. When an artist realizes that, then they go, okay, I'm going to give you my time, and guess what? I'm going to give you some nuggets that I know their fans will enjoy, because it's not information that's in the public domain. So mining for that stuff comes from them hearing you having done that level of work, and that you are respecting and keeping them safe, because your job is not to out them. You don't want to put them on, the front page of, a tabloid newspaper. What you want to do is help them tell their story so that their songs can fly.
Perfectly put. Now, I understand that you were involved in some capacity with some of these artists when they toured South Africa. Tell us more about that.
One of the many interviews that I did in the early 90s was with a band called The Outsiders. And they were this indie rock band from Pretoria, and I was living in Pretoria and working in Pretoria at the time. And I went and interviewed this band in Sunny Park. I'm not sure if that still exists as a building or place to shop. But so, yeah, we hooked up at a coffee shop. We had an interview, did the interview. It was for Top 40, so that was great. The next day, I get a phone call from the guy who started the band, Druki Botha. And he said, "Don't you want to manage us?" And I said, and I had a day job at this stage. And I said, "Dude, I've never managed a band in my life, but I'm happy to help." And he told me all the tragic tales of the 5 managers that they'd had before them who had all taken the money and run. And so I then started to manage this band called The Outsiders, and I helped secure gigs for them and, that kind of thing, and just make sure that all of their kind of record contract stuff was sorted. And then this opportunity came along when Depeche Mode arrived in 1994. One of the first bands, certainly at the time, 1994, not a small year in South Africa's history.
Yeah.
And the band was signed to David Gresham. And David Gresham at the time had the rights to the Mute catalog. And one of the Mute artists happened to be Depeche Mode. And in those days, if an international act came into South Africa, there had to be a local support artist. Yep. So I then got pushed into a room with Roddy Quinn to negotiate a contract with Big Concerts to have The Outsiders support Depeche Mode. And this was a band who was current. They weren't the Frank Sinatras and the Shirley Bassies that played at Sun City, in the 80s. This was a band that had a brand new album. They were touring the world and they came to South Africa. And it was a completely new reality. It was something that was, we had never experienced anything like that ever in South Africa. And so I negotiated this contract with Roddy, and it was torrid from a payment perspective, but we obviously took it because it was an extraordinary opportunity for the band. And we played 3 or 4 nights at the Standard Bank Arena at the time. We did 2 shows in Cape Town. We did one in Durban, but we basically did this national tour. And, and I was managing this band. So I would obviously just take leave from work and then travel around the country, touring with one of the greatest bands in the world, for 10 or 14 days. And it took us from being very backyard kind of third world into a very first world cutting edge reality. And it was an extraordinary experience. And then after that, I landed up working for EMI as the head of international promotions. And that was when I got the opportunity to work with artists who were coming into South Africa as part of their international touring programs. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Janet Jacksons of the world, the Placebos of the world, Massive Attack, Garbage, all of those bands. I was kind of had a weird role in chaperoning and looking after them and making sure that they were well looked after while they were in South Africa. So lots of wonderful memories.
Top 40 is now no longer digital. Am I correct? Or is there anything happening?
It's long defunct. So yes, it is. It's sadly very long defunct. It certainly doesn't exist as far as I know. I edited the final issue, I think, in 2002, and after which the then publisher of the magazine got it on a plane and headed off to Canada, never to be seen again. And it was tragic because the magazine should not have died, but it did. But the trademark was owned by the publisher, and who knows, maybe at some point she may decide to resuscitate it. But it lived for 19 years, and the likes of Alex J and many of the DJs that we know and love to this day either featured or contributed towards its success. And it's a piece of history, a bit like Number One and Smash Hits. They don't exist today, but they are kind of part of the foundation of where pop music is today.
Dori asked me to ask you about the pen pal section in Top 40 magazine. She met one of her dearest friends through that pen pal section. And, what was the inspiration for that? And was it a way to connect music aficionados in the country? Because naturally, there wasn't any social media or any of those type of things. So did you guys see it as a way to create a foundation of music fans and connecting them together?
It was a bridge, exactly that, because as you point out, there was no internet, there was no other way that you could connect with, certainly with musicians and with your audience. So it was literally like creating communities, and giving people an opportunity to literally put pen to paper, and become part of that little network. And I mean, I remember, again, I'm kind of fast forwarding, but I remember in 1994 when I got invited to Barcelona to interview Radiohead, reaching out to, in those days, again, rudimentary internet, to kind of chat forums, going, I'm about to get on a plane and fly to Barcelona to interview Radiohead. And I would target these various fan groups that had been set up and say to them, well, give me your questions that you've always wanted to ask Tom York or anyone else in the band, and I will get them answered for you and I'll bring them back. And that's what Top 40 was doing, with that pen pal section, was going, talk to us, because we've kind of got access. Well, we're certainly closer to the artist than you will ever be. So let's create a community that celebrates a particular artist, whether that was Duran Duran or, Milli Vanilli or whoever it was. And then taking those messages, presenting them to the record company, who would hear us, because if you were Joe Blogg living in Boksburg, no one would take your call. So we kind of looked at ways of trying to get fans' voices heard. And it was very powerful, because I think if you received feedback on your request, it influenced you massively in your life, where, someone that you loved and, were fanatical about, you kind of get this letter sent back to you going, hi, Barrett, thanks for reaching out. I appreciate your comments, or whatever the feedback was. I mean, that's gold. That's gold and you can't put a price on that. So that, I think, was the point, was creating a community, and then where we could be able to respond to as much of it as we could, because, as you say, it was pre-internet. So it was literally sending faxes and it was telephone calls. But it was a rich community that I think the audience of the magazine appreciated.
It was a community that were no trolls, and it wasn't filtered, and it was real.
Imagine what a novel concept in 2022, right? It's like, well, nobody had any ill intention, other than if they could be accused of anything, that they were selfishly wanting to literally be front and center with an artist, a bit like a meet and greet. And I remember doing many of those where, I've never suffered. I've probably done 3 or 4 interviews in the thousands that I've done, where you suffer that fanboy moment where you're just going, it's that person. And you know what I mean? For the most part, I've never suffered that, but there are a few where it's very clear that I'm suffering from a fanboy moment. Can you imagine what that's like for an average fan? If I said to you, this is your favorite artist of all time, and it's defined how you've lived your life to this point, and I'm going to give you 15 minutes with this person. I mean, it's going to be, you can't buy that. And we did that for a lot of people. And I think that's the joy of music, is that music doesn't only bring people together, it breaks down so many barriers. I mean, we saw it in 1985, at the concert in the park. All of a sudden you had people who, were racially divided coming together, for an entire day, celebrating music, black, white, and everything in between. And that's that's the power of music. That's what music can do and does to this day, regardless of what we suffer, troll and otherwise.
It's interesting you're saying that these meet and greets, the artist doesn't know any of these people, and and yet all these people think they know the artist because they've read the magazine articles, they've followed their tweets, they've got their music. And I'm sure there were instances where the fan was somehow let down, potentially in the sense that I know you're supposed to know me, in inverted commas. And there's that,
the disappointment factor is high. No, exactly. There's a lot has been written about it as well, is that you should never meet your idols, because you will be disappointed, because in your mind you've had 10 years to build up this image of meeting the late great Mark Hollis from Talk Talk, and when you meet him, he's as dry as a piece of toast and is completely and you're like going, but you're Mark Hollis, you should be brilliant. And yet he's not. And you're like going, well, yeah, because now you're peeling back a layer that wasn't presented to you in the final execution. So, it's it's in the same way that you meet someone like Michael Jackson and you go, yeah, but you're Michael Jackson and you can do the moonwalk and you do all of this stuff, and then you meet him and he comes across as a bit kind of wet and naff, and you're like going, oh, that's disappointing. But you didn't buy into them for that. You bought into them for what they delivered.
Yeah.
So there is that weird moment where you kind of decide, do I really want to get to know you better? Do I want you to be a bedfellow, or do I just want you to be what I have built up in my mind? Yeah, as a fan of your music.
Most of the people meet those artists thinking they use gold-plated toilet paper, and then when they realize then use 1 or 2 ply, it's a bit of a shock to their system.
I think it is because of how arguably the job that I did. And look, I've spent my career making a lot of artists who are not particularly either smart or they're particularly gifted at what they do, but they can't articulate their genius. I've had to present them in a way where they sound like gold loo roll. But when you speak to them, there's you're talking to 1 ply. So it's a challenge, because what you're trying to do is land the music, not necessarily the things that they're not particularly good at. So you're really trying to keep them safe from their fallibilities and their foibles, because that's not the point. Their job, they're entertainers. They're there to entertain. But at the end of the day, they're also people. So a lot of the artists that I've interviewed are brilliant musicians, but they really suck at life. They're just not good at it. But put them on a stage and they become somebody else completely different. And that's what I look to protect. That's what I look to present, because their personal life is exactly that. It's their personal life. And it's not for you or I to question that. What we should celebrate is what they deliver. And we can challenge them on what that is. But on the rest of it, that's by permission only.
Yeah.
And many of the interviews that you've done and the access that they've given you is by permission.
Absolutely. But where we interact with anyone in life, myself and you, strangers in the street, we can either walk next to each other and not say a word, or we can look at each other, engage energetically and speak, but it's agreed and invited. So
exactly. Respectful.
Exactly. This has been an interesting episode of That 80s Show. Jason, what final comment, or for the people who just listen to the music, just receive the delivery of that artistic creation, what words of wisdom, gold-ply toilet paper, would you suggest or give to them as the bridge between the artists and the music and them?
I would say, and these aren't pearls of wisdom or gold-laced toilet rolls, it's make it your own, as it's always been, because music is a very personal experience. The way that you taste wine and the way that I taste wine, very different. We're drinking from the same bottle, but we're tasting different things. So it makes it very personal, and keep it that way, because it's your journey, your experience, and don't let the noise or the trolls or anyone else in between taint that. Your interpretation and your respect and enjoyment of the thing that you are hearing, that's kind of what it's about, because it's personal. And it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks or says, because it's your journey. And that's the joy of music, is that, whether you're Ed Sheeran or Dua Lipa or whoever it is, in current terms, your relationship is very personal. So you take the things from the things you read, the music that you hear, and you internalize that, and it kind of forms how you see the world and how you appreciate the world. So yeah, keep it personal, and don't buy into tabloid and silliness. Just listen or deep listen to the music and enjoy it, because ultimately that's what it's about.
We are creating the soundtrack to the journey of our lives.
Exactly. And it's your journey. It's independent of the rest of the world. And how wonderful is that in a world where it's filled with so many other distractions, that you can create a space that's uniquely yours, informed by so many of these extraordinary artists, from Leo Sayer, from Elton John, from Jim Morrison, whoever it may be, these people have informed and are building blocks to each of us. So you've got a bit of Jim Morrison in you, you've got a bit of Eagles in you, you've got imagination thrown in between. That's your quirk. That's what makes you who you are. So if I had to define you musically, it would be a rich space because it's filled with not necessarily one particular genre. It could be Pink Floyd, it could be a bit of Joy Division. It could be Terence Trent D'Arby, as you were mentioning earlier. And that's wonderful because that's unique to you. Because my journey is, yes, there's some Terence in there. Absolutely. There's Kylie in there. There's a whole bunch of other things. And that's where the commonality comes in, where we can talk about, if we did come together around a table and break bread, we would talk about the things that really excite us about each of those artists' music. And that makes for a rich conversation.
You finished off on Kylie, which is actually my favorite artist. So I'm just giggling to myself. So, Jason, it's been a pleasure diving into the world of the media, music, and everything in between with two-ply toilet paper. So this is and single ply, yes, and maybe some newspaper. Who knows?
Imagine.
So this is That 80s Show, and signing off. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.